Welcome back to Management 720. Let's get started with Chapter 4. In the last several chapters, we've been learning about variable costs and fixed costs and contribution margin in order to use this model to help us make decisions. In Chapter 2, the decision was how do we predict future costs, and we came up with the high-low method for a linear equation to use data to predict costs in the future. In the last chapter, we learned how to use contribution margin to figure out what is the break-even point or what are the amount of units or the sales volume necessary to make a certain level of profit. Well, we are extending that model, the contribution, fixed cost, variable cost model, into even more, relevant, pun intended, types of decisions. So we're going to add a little bit more to the model, specifically relevant versus irrelevant cost, and then we're going to look at a couple of special types of decisions that are common in many types of industries, starting with Learning Objective 4. How do you decide to take on a special order? Learning Objective 5. Should you outsource? In other words, should you make something or should you buy it from a vendor? Should you sell something or process it further? And what should you do if you have limited resources for a certain type of production? The first thing we're going to look at is the concept of what is a relevant cost versus an irrelevant cost. Now, as opposed to GAAP accounting, which requires inclusion of all costs in the financial statements, managerial accounting typically only looks at those costs that help us make decisions, and we term those costs relevant cost. What is a relevant cost? It's something that happens in the future, and it differs between alternatives, and sometimes we have a special type of relevant cost called an opportunity cost, meaning if you choose one path versus another, you may forego some benefits. In other words, you've decided to get an MBA rather than continue on in your career, so you have perhaps foregone some earning potential to try and improve your earning potential by getting an MBA to improve your earning potential in the future. So that would be an opportunity cost. And it's not that we ignore the costs totally, it's just we do not include them in our decision-making framework. So that's important. When I say a cost is irrelevant, it's not that it's not going to be paid or it's something that we don't pay attention to as far as normal financial accounting. It's just we're not going to include that information in our decision because, as we can see here, irrelevant costs are the results of past decisions and do not differ between alternatives. There's a common phrase or common word for irrelevant past decision costs, and we call those sunk costs, and I'll talk about those in a second. Let's take a look at the top, though. I've got a very simple example that sort of illustrates the idea between relevant and irrelevant. Let's say you are renting a condo, and if you rent it solo, your rent would be $1,200, your utilities would be $200. There is one car park that comes along with this condo, or there's one potential car park, but you have to pay extra. And you have an alternative of bringing in two roommates. If you have two roommates, well, you're the primary renter, so you would be paying the majority of it. But the roomies would just, you'd have the main bedroom with the bathroom, and the roomies would have to share a bathroom, so they're paying less, basically. You're paying $800, your roomies are paying $200 each. Utilities for solo were $200, but with three people, perhaps the utilities are more. They're $350 divided by three people. And because your roommates would be occupying some rooms, perhaps you've got to put some stuff into storage. So if we look at the relevant costs, those that differ between the alternatives, solo, the rent is different between being solo and having two roomies. The utilities are different between being solo and having two roomies. Notice that the car park, you're going to be paying $250 to be able to park your car there, no matter whether you do it solo or two roomies. So this is in a situation where we don't ignore the fact that you're paying $250. That is a cost that you have to pay. It's just a cost that's the same between the alternatives, and therefore we don't include it in our decision. Storage is also a cost that differs between the two alternatives. So if we look at just the relevant costs, they're $1,400 for the Solo and $1,300. Now that's not the total cost of what you'd actually pay. It's just the relevant cost that would go into making the decision. Sunk costs are a tricky subject. How many times have you decided or seen or heard about someone decide, a business, decide to keep going because they've already put so much money into it? And I'll just give you a recent big example. When Mark Zuckerberg decided to change the name of the company from Facebook to Meta because he was all in on the metaverse, right? And he spent billions of dollars chasing this metaverse idea, just billions, and wouldn't come up off of it. Those are sunk costs. When he made each year he made the decision to keep going, and it didn't look like the metaverse was going to, become a big deal. He pursued it much longer. In fact, he had many investors who were after him to stop doing this. Really, the only reason that it's changed recently is because AI has become more prominent. Now, Zuckerberg didn't come out and say, I've stopped the metaverse and I'm pursuing AI now. He just slowly and quietly, I don't want to say slowly, quickly and quietly just let the metaverse thing kind of die away and has now jumped on the AI bandwagon. But it's sunk costs are sometimes we call throwing good money after bad. It can lead to decision distortion because you feel like you've already spent so much money on something that you need to see it through or something like that, and it can be difficult to ignore. But from a managerial standpoint, it's an irrelevant cost. Whatever money you've spent in the past, if it doesn't affect something in the future, then you shouldn't consider it. But it's very hard. Human nature is just such that it's very hard to ignore sunk costs. So that should be a trigger for you as a manager. Are you obsessing or are you overly focused on sunk costs when you shouldn't be? And here's a thing that just the last little bit here, disposal and salvage values, because the first part of the book talks a lot about depreciation. Disposal and salvage values can be relevant if they differ, right? That's the main thing. They have to differ between the alternatives. Okay, let's increase our understanding of the idea of relevant versus irrelevant costs. So here I have an example from the book. You have keep the old machine or replace with a new machine. It looks like the new machine would have different costs, different maintenance, different inspection, and disposal of the old unit. Now, if you look under the column of keep the old machine, it's just the norm. These are the costs if you do nothing. In the first column, replace with the new machine. These are how the costs would differ from the old machine. Now you notice the conversion cost is a little bit different. Conversion costs are direct labor and manufacturing overhead. Inspection and adjustment, it requires less cost in inspection. Machine maintenance is much lower. And then, of course, an increase of cost that isn't in the do nothing is the cost of the new machine for $80,000. But notice, disposal of old machine. We don't put that under the old machine column because that's not an action you would take when you do nothing. The disposal of the machine is a do something, is replacing with a new machine also requires us to dispose of the old machine. So that would be an action that would only happen if we took the replace alternatives. So we put the disposal of the old machine. Now you notice here, this is a reduction of costs. In other words, we sell off the old machine and get $35,000. That offsets these other costs. When we go over to the difference column, the conversion costs are, it's cheaper by $40,000. Inspection is cheaper by $14,000, et cetera, et cetera. So really the only additional cost is the cost of the new machine. So when you put all those together, the cost of the new machine, $80,000, is outweighed by all the other cost savings, so that in total you would have a cost saving of $17,800. And that cost saving is termed an advantage. In other words, when you have a scenario where it's do nothing or do this alternative, you phrase the alternative as being either an advantageous alternative or a not advantageous a disadvantageous alternative. So what do we add to the concept of relevance? Some comparisons are between a do-nothing state and a single alternative. There can be both increases of cost or decreases of costs. Both of them, you have to look for all of them. And just notice that even the disposal of the machine, the old machine, is part of the alternatives costs. We are talking about, if we wanted to take a wider, rather than just say relevant versus irrelevant, we call this sort of topical area differential analysis. And we focus on items that differ. What are the benefits that we get out of this? We provide a clearer picture and less confusion. I have seen many times in not board meetings, but larger manager meetings where managers are arguing over a cost, only to find out that cost is irrelevant, that it didn't differ between the alternatives. So by streamlining all the information, you're only looking at things that differ between alternatives. Also, when you're only focused on relevant cost, it's quicker and easier to prepare, and it should simplify complex issues. Okay, let's continue increasing this model, this relevant versus irrelevant cost model, the differential analysis model. And we're going to look at another example from the book. And I'll just mention that you probably figured out by now. When the example from the book is clean and clear enough, I typically try and use it because you can always go back and look at it. But at times the textbooks examples can be a little convoluted or overly confusing, or sometimes just miss the point entirely. And if that's the case, I use my own example. But I think this one's pretty clear. Although the textbook has 3 alternatives, it's just enough for us to look at 2 alternatives to understand the point. So we're building on this differential analysis model. So here we have Uber is deciding to do something. They are going to offer some sort of bonus program, or they're going to try a couple of different types of projects to see if they can improve profit. And so the first alternative is they're going to have a bonus program. Every 500 miles completes within a month, the driver will get an extra $25. The bonus program is expected to result in 10% increase and a bonus payout of 10. So if we look at the alternative 1, let's not worry about the first line quite yet. Let's just look at the second one. The profit decrease from the bonus, right? We're paying out a bonus. That means profits are going to go down by 10,000. But the profit increase from increased miles, in other words, where the program is designed to entice drivers to do more, to drive more or drive further. So for every 500 miles completes within a month, the driver will get an additional $25. That's the bonus payout. And so they're anticipating paying out of those $25 increments a total of $10,000. But from driving, just doing the extra driving, and of course they're not just driving by themselves, they're driving passengers. If they're driving passengers, what's the increase to profit from, an increased workload driving passengers? If we look at the very top, it says contribution margin per every 10 miles is $6, $45 selling price minus $39 variable cost, and we know selling price minus variable cost is contribution margin. So every 10 miles, it's an additional $6. So how did they come to the number up there? So profit increase for miles. Well, if the average is 300 miles, again, looking at the top, and they're going to increase that by 10%, so that's 330 miles, or the difference is an increase of 30,000 miles. Now, remember, though, you don't get paid $6 every mile. You get paid, or the contribution margin doesn't go up $6 every mile. It goes up every 10 miles. So if there's an increase of 30,000 miles, there's 3,000 increments. It goes up every 10 miles. So goes up 3,000 times. So 3,000 times 6. So they anticipate $18,000 in profit just by driving further, or enticing the Uber drivers to drive further. But they're going to have to pay out a bonus, but it looks like the bonus is worth it. Now, of course, $18,000 versus $10,000 is only $8,000. This may seem like a small amount of money, but a lot of times when we're doing these analysis, these are in terms of $1,000 or some other big number. So this may be $18 million and $10 million for an increase of $8 million. Well, that's more realistic, right? So a lot of times we just truncate the number to make it simpler and easier to digest. Alternative 2, increasing the cost of the rides to the customers by an average $1 per every 10 miles. The average payout will remain a constant at 35 per 10 miles. This should result in a decrease of 50,000 in monthly miles. So essentially here we've got a different alternative, and if you're interested, please go through and calculate it for yourself. There's enough information here. But the upshot is the alternative is there's a profit increase from the increased price. The increased price is going to result in reduced miles. But you notice here, the reduced miles sort of overwhelms the increase in the price. So they increase the price. They realize there's going to be fewer miles driven. Well, that ends up netting out to $5,000 or maybe $5 million in decrease in monthly profit. So basically what you do with these alternatives is you just run the numbers. You figure out what's the effect, you run the numbers and look at the increases and decreases, net them out and see if there's an increase or decrease. So what additional thing do we learn about the differential analysis? Well, first of all, most likely in most situations, there are going to be increases and decreases, and we want to net the difference. So be on the lookout for situations or items to where some of them are going to be increases to cost and some of them are decreases to cost, or alternatively, increase to profit or decrease to profit. You notice here, as opposed to the previous two scenarios, we looked at, in addition to costs, we also focus on profits. We'll also focus on revenues. So it's not just a cost. Differential analysis is not just for costs, it's for revenues and costs. And you notice we've also introduced the idea of contribution margin of variable costs. And that's where, that's what ties it to chapter 2 and 3. Because a lot of times when we're doing this differential analysis, we're talking in terms of contribution margin and variable costs. So this is kind of, and I guess the other thing I would say is these are two true alternatives, whereas the previous one was a do nothing and a single alternative. This one, in the textbook, it's actually 3 different alternatives. They're planning on doing one of the 3. So alternatives can be mutually exclusive. They can be 2 different things, and they could be both. We're doing something, just which something should we do? From here, so learning objective 1, 2, and 3 is kind of building up the process of how to do differential analysis. And now what we're going to do is apply it to 4 situations: special orders, outsourcing, sell. Normally we say sell as is or process further, but this textbook says sell or process further, and then limited resources. So our first one is a special order. And what we mean by that is we're a manufacturing plant producing something. We have some excess capacity at the end of the year, or it could technically be at any time during the year. It's just an order above and beyond our normal, regular customer orders. And if we have capacity, we can contemplate whether or not we do sort of a one-time special order and how that would work out. Now, we have 4 different scenarios: special orders, outsourcing, seller process further, and limited resources. Now, for each of these, I'm going to give you kind of the vanilla way to look at it, and then look at 1 or 2 or 3 complications that would change the analysis or how they would affect the analysis. And that is I found to be the same couple of complications that every textbook uses. So for this particular example, let's say we've got a factory that's producing, it doesn't matter what, just we're producing something where our total capacity is 3,000 units per year, and we are making 2,000 units, or we have orders for 2,000 units. So if we look at our variable costs of $10, in other words, that's like the coffee, from the coffee cup example, that's buying the coffee pod. The variable costs are the costs necessary to actually make the product that we sell. Fixed costs are other things like rent or insurance, things like that, and that we need to spread over our however many units we're selling. So 10,000 units, we're making 2,000 units, so it's an additional $5 per unit of fixed cost. So the total cost per unit, and I should stress this, the total cost per unit at 2,000 is $15 per unit, because if we make more, well, the fixed cost per unit would go down. And although it's not necessary here, what if the our selling price is 18? So let's take the first special order scenario, which is just the basic scenario. Is we receive a special order. They want us to make 500 units, and they want it to be a total cost of $17 per unit. Now, at first glance, you would say, well, our total cost is 15. If we try and sell something at 12, aren't we going to lose $3? Well, here is the first main trick about special orders. Remember, we're thinking in terms of relevant versus irrelevant costs. Now, the fixed costs, when we talk about total cost of unit is 15, we've already spread over the total $10,000 of fixed costs, right? The 2,000 units that we're already making for our normal customers, we've already baked in, we've already applied that $10,000 of fixed costs over those 2,000 units. So there's no need to apply any extra costs for fixed costs to the special order. So really the only relevant cost is just the variable cost. In other words, those materials and labor or whatever is necessary just to build the extra 500, because the fixed costs have already been taken care of, I guess you could say, by the other 2,000 units that we were making in our normal production run. So if we just say, okay, to actually build an extra 500 to be only $10 per unit, and you're going to pay us 12, well, that would be incremental profit, right? It would be 12 times 500 or $6,000. So special order scenario one, we would say the irrelevant cost is fixed cost because they've already been accounted for by the normal production. So therefore, the only relevant cost is the $10. Okay, well, let's add a complication. Special order number two. Someone wants to come in and buy 500 at $12, but let's say they want something special. I don't know what it would be. Let's say whatever we're making, they want a special color. Well, those special colors, remember, this is the alternative. Either we can do nothing, just continue our normal production, or the alternative is to do this special order, but there are some extra costs. Now, these costs are relevant because they wouldn't happen under the do nothing scenario. They only happen under the accept the special order scenario. So whereas before the relevant cost was only the $10 of variable costs, now the relevant costs are going to be the $10 of the variable cost plus this $1,500 in extra cost, because like I say, it could be anything. Let's just say it's a different color, a special color. So if you could either do it one way, you could extend them out and figure out what the total costs are. I've just chosen to figure out what is the per unit cost. So if I divide that $1,500 of extra cost over the 500 extra units, that's an extra $3 per unit. So we would have the $10 of variable cost plus an extra $3 per unit to cover the extra cost. Therefore, the relevant cost per unit is $13. They want to pay us 12, no profit, so therefore no go. The next complication, special order number 3. Let's say they want to buy 500 units at $12, but instead of our max capacity being 3,000, you notice I didn't mention it, but in the previous two scenarios, when they asked for us to produce 500, well, the 500 was easily attainable because we had excess capacity. So special orders really rely upon excess capacity. And this is why. Looking at number 3, if our max capacity was only 2,400 units and they wanted us to build an additional 500 units, well, obviously we have capacity for the first 400 units of that special order, and they would be done sort of at special order scenario number 1. Just that they're paying us 12, our variable costs are 10, therefore it'd be profit of $2 times the first 400, so 800. But the 100 that go over capacity, well, we can't just willy-nilly go over capacity. We have to either open a new facility, well, that's more expensive, but most likely is what we do is we choose not to honor some other customer's order. We end up, shorting some other customer, or maybe there's a new customer that we don't, we just choose to give their capacity to the special order. Now think about what that means. That 100 from the previous customer, their costs were carrying the fixed costs, right? So the previous 2,000 units, if we had to steal 100 out of that previous normal production of 2,000 units, well, those were already built in as costs of $15 because they were supporting the fixed costs. So that last 100 units, if we steal it from someone else, that what we're doing is the total cost of those would be 15. We'd be being paid 12 for that last 100. So we would lose $3 on that last 100. So what would the upshot be? We'd make $800 on the first 400 units. We'd lose $300 on the last 100 units. So a total net of 500. So that's still profit, but would you do it? What would you do it? So that brings us to some qualitative issues. So we can look at the numbers and just tell us from a numbers point of view, would we do it or not do it? But most of these decisions have a qualitative, meaning a non-numeric part of the answer. First of all, the thing you need to do with the special order is it needs to be stressed as one time only. We don't want them coming back and said, well, next year they come back and say, well, you gave me $12 per unit last year. I'll go ahead and take that same thing this year. And you'll say, nope, that was a one-time situational thing where we had excess capacity. Because if they try and come back and negotiate a long-term contract at $12, that's not going to work because we need to take care of the fixed costs. And the second thing is, if we're close to capacity, is it worth it to upset existing customers? Even though you might, by taking this special order, you might end up making $500 extra, or like I say, this could be $500,000 extra if these are in thousands. Is it worth it to upset a customer that's maybe ordering a lot more or more regularly? You don't know if this special order will be coming back on a regular basis. So the answer typically is no. If it's going into capacity, you would typically say no, not only because of what the profit or non-profit would be. You have a qualitative decision to try and work with your existing customers. Normally, not every situation. It's just part of the decision making. Let's look at our next special case, which is outsourcing, or should we make it or should we buy it? Again, I've got a couple of different scenarios showing the base scenario, which is number one, plus a couple of normal complications to the scenario. So let's take a look at the situation. We're producing 2,000 of something, and this is going to be very similar to the last scenario. We have variable cost of 10. Our fixed costs are 10,000, which at a level of production of 2,000 units is $5 per unit, and the total cost per unit is 15. So in the first just vanilla sort of scenario, should we make it or should we buy it, i.e. should we outsource it? Let's say a vendor comes to us and says, we can make that same product and we will sell it to you. You can buy it from us for $17 per unit. Well, if we look at the bare bones, we could make it ourselves for $15 a unit, which is cheaper than buying at $17. So we would just straight up say no. If there were no other complications or no other factors going on, and so consequently, if someone came and says, well, we can make that for $12 per unit, we would definitely do it if there were no other complications. If we make it for 15, they sell it to us for 12. That's a very easy decision as well. So the first one is no. They're selling it for too much. Well, what would be one complication? We can outsource it for $13, right? They sell it to us for $13. So on the face of that, us making it for 15, them selling it to us for 13 looks good. But let's say 6,000 of the fixed cost is unavoidable. What do I mean by that? Well, if we end up buying it from this vendor for 13, well, we're going to have no variable costs because variable costs come from producing items. And the fixed costs, I guess sometimes, we can assume that they're all avoidable, meaning the fixed costs all go away, or perhaps in this particular situation, we're only using part of the factory to make this whatever it is. And it's, even though we can avoid some costs, maybe we don't have any certain machine maintenance or certain, supervisors or other types of fixed costs, perhaps we still have to pay the rent on the overall factory building because we're using it for other things. So if we say we can buy it from the vendor for $13, but we still have to take care of $6,000 of unavoidable fixed costs, well, that's going to be $13 per unit plus this $6,000. That would be alternative 2, right? Alternative 1 is we make it for $15 times 2,000 or $30,000. Or if we buy it from them, we buy it from them for $13 times 2,000, which is 26,000. Plus, we still have to pay the 6,000 unavoidable costs for a total of 32. So make it all in is 30. Buy it, even though the per unit price is cheaper, we still have other unavoidable costs we need to take care of. Therefore, the all-in cost for buying it is $32K, and therefore, again, no deal. And the situation could be different. What if the unavoidable costs are only $2,000? That would be 26 plus 2K. That would be 28K, and so we would do it in that case. Buy number 3, this is yet a different sort of complication. Whereas in buy scenario number 2, there are additional costs. In buy scenario number 3, there's additional savings. And what do I mean by this? Let's say a vendor comes to us and says, okay, you can buy it from us. You can outsource it for $17 a piece. Well, we're making it at $15. $17 seems too high. But if we stop making this product, we theoretically, maybe we free up one of our factory buildings. If we free up one of our factory buildings where we were making it, but now we're buying it, perhaps we can rent out that space. So here, just the straight 15 versus 17 does not look okay. Under the first scenario where we're making it ourselves, it's $15 per unit times 2,000 or 30,000. If we buy, yes, the per piece unit is expensive. 17 times 2,000 is $34,000, but we would also be bringing in $5,000 for renting that space. That $5,000 of income would offset the $34,000 of cost, the pay, what we're paying. So 34,000 minus 5,000 is 29. It's marginally better than doing it ourselves. Now again, there's qualitative judgment or decisions that have to be brought into it. Is it worth? Is the person we're outsourcing to reliable? Have they had any shortages or times when they haven't been able to meet demand? If that's the case, perhaps that $1,000 of savings isn't worth having losing our supply chain or losing our supply because the vendor is not reliable. So it's going to be a cost benefit analysis, and some of the benefits may be just qualitative. We'd like to make it in-house because we change that. Maybe we change that product often. Maybe that thing is upgraded very often. So it's better to do it ourselves rather than trying to spec that every year with our vendor. And I'll just also point out that the phrasing advantage versus disadvantage that you'll see in the textbook is referred to between if we do, in this particular case, if we do nothing, in other words, continue to make it ourselves, what is the alternative? Is it advantageous to choose the alternative or disadvantageous to choose the alternative? Continuing on, our next special situation is sell or process further. And this situation is where you have a product and you have the potential to improve it, maybe upgrade it or have a deluxe version. But this improved version of your product will require extra cost. But on the flip side, you could also charge more for it. So the analysis really is, will the market sustain an increase in price that offsets the increased cost necessary to improve the product? And so while we're looking at this just from a cost accounting, from a managerial point of view, this really, whenever we're talking about the profit, additional profit, or the additional contribution margin, at some level there, there is a marketing piece to this, because if we just look at this scenario, it says sell after assembly, the selling price is 40, the sell after painting. Well, because we haven't done it yet, because we haven't sold it after painting, that $75 that we're projecting as the sell price, we don't really know. So it's typically not the accountants who project what a potential sell price could be from upgrading an item. That's typically where marketing steps in and tells us, well, a similar item like this that is painted can be sold for in a neighborhood of $75. So just realize that before we make the upgrade change, the increase of the selling price, which is what we're really relying upon to offset the costs, has to be sort of verified by a group outside of the cost accounting group. So here we do have a do nothing. That means continue to sell it as we've been selling it, or there's an alternative to process it further. Now, we're again dealing with relevant costs, and here relevant revenues or profits. You notice here in this particular situation, we have a selling price. There's a difference in selling price. There's assembly costs. You notice that the assembly costs are the same between the two items. Therefore, the assembly cost, at least for this analysis, it's not that we don't get away with not paying assembly costs. They're just irrelevant for our decision making. The relevant items are going to be the selling price, and selling price minus the assembly costs, the variable costs, equals the contribution margin. Now notice the improved version, the sell after painting, has an additional cost, that's sanding and painting. So the selling after painting has an additional relevant cost. That is, the difference is $0 for sell after assembly and $12 sell after painting. So when we look at the differential analysis, there's an increase in the selling price of $35 and an increase in cost of $12 for a total increase of contribution margin of $23. So of course, $23, if we can get that 75, you notice we're basically directly looking, does the increase in the selling price, $35, more than compensate for the increase in cost, which were $12? And the item is here. So the other thing that this particular example doesn't show is a lot of times when you upgrade a production item, is that because it's more expensive, you tend to sell less of them. So if we had a even more complicated version of this example, there would be sell after assembly 1,000, sell after painting 800 or something like that. And then we would have to do a little bit more analysis. So this is a basic analysis, but just to give you an idea that basically we add costs and we add price, and to see if which one offsets the other. Now, there are times when, and I'm looking at the last part of this page, is the bottom part, is when we're talking about joint products. Sometimes you may have a range of products. You may have 3 or 4 different products, and they all start off in the same way. Like here, even if we just said maybe we do both the unpainted and painted version. Well, notice both of them are assembled for $25, and then they separate. One is sold immediately after assembly, and then one goes to the painting shop, right? So we call products that share an initial stage a joint product. And then after some point, and we call this point the split off point, after the split off point, this sort of generic product then becomes can become multiple different products. And the point here is that the initial stage costs, our joint costs, are irrelevant. The only relevant costs are the ones that happen after the split off point. So here, if we took sell after assembly and sell after painting, you notice the assembly costs, which they both go through, those are joint costs, are irrelevant, and only the costs that happen after the split off point, when one goes to the paint shop, the $12 becomes a relevant cost. The last special situation that we're looking at is limited resources. And this is actually a favorite of mine, theory of constraints. This is useful in a lot of places. And it's fairly straightforward and intuitive once you've heard the explanation, typically for the first time. Then after that, it seems very, very intuitive. So let's just look at this. We've got some sort of thing that we're making. They're called personal training packages, but just call them three different products A, B, and C. And during the, because trying to do some of these explanations when you're talking about services is not quite as straightforward, or it doesn't seem to be as understandable as if we just talked about making a product. So let's just consider A, B, and C are three different products, and suppose that there's some machine in the workshop that you can only have 120 labor hours per week. So when we look at just the individual unit, so I'm looking at the top chart. If we just look at the individual unit price, the unit cost, and the unit contribution margin, it looks like B is the one that has the largest potential profit. But we're going to add in a constraint. The constraint here is that the three different products take different amounts of time to do. It takes 1 hour to do product C, it takes 3 hours to do product B, and 4 hours to do product A. And if we had unlimited hours in a week, then obviously we would do the one that made us the most money each time we did it. That would be the 45. But if we only have 120 hours, that's going to be our constraint. We're going to reinterpret the contribution margin in terms of the constraint. And what do I mean by that? Look at the middle chart. If we say, okay, 40, 45, and 25 is the unit contribution of each of the three. But if I do it in terms of the constraint, meaning what is the contribution margin per hour? Well, for product C, it only takes 1 hour, so it's still $25 of contribution per hour. Whereas B and A take a lot more time. And we look and see that their contribution per hour is $15 per hour and $10 per hour. So we would make fewer products of A and B. And even though each time we make a unit and sell it, it's individually worth more, we can produce a lot more of the cheaper one and still make more money by producing all of C. And we look at chart 3 or the table 3 to see that. So if we say there's 120 hours available and we divide it by how long it takes for each one, we can make 30 of A, 40 of B, or 120 of C. 120 of C times its contribution margin is going to be the most, 3,000. And then obviously you can see we make a lot less for the other ones, 1,800 and 1,200. So limited resources doesn't just focus on the contribution margin. It focuses on the contribution margin per unit of the constrained resource. And so for each individual problem, the constrained resource will be a little different, but you have to define it as contribution margin per unit of constrained resource. In this situation, it was hours. Therefore, the highest contribution margin per hour is C. When you run the numbers, C has the most. Now, even though, and again, here we're talking about a qualitative rather than a quantitative decision, management might still say, okay, we are still going to produce 5 or 10 of A and B because we want to have, those are products that customers like, and we still want to offer a broad range of products rather than just sell one type of product. So they might choose to do a less than optimal production schedule because they have other qualitative factors in mind that they want to produce at least 5 of each unit. Sometimes there's a second constraint that's entered in. So let's say you say, okay, the first constraint is 120 labor hours, and you run through and say, okay, I can produce 120 of these of numbers of letter C and make $3,000. But what if the constraint is, well, the second constraint is there's only demand for 90 of C per year or per week or whatever it is. And then you say, okay, well, it still makes sense to, we're going to produce up to to the second constraint. We're going to produce up to 90 of C to maximize that. Then what do we do with the next bit? Well, we have 30 more hours, so we would move on to the next highest contribution margin per hour, which would be B. And we would say, okay, it takes 3 hours of those, so we'd produce 90 of C and we'd produce 10 of B, because B requires 3 hours per unit. So if we have 30 extra hours after doing 90 of C, we'd produce 10 of B. Okay, well, it's a good thing that I am recording this in segments because of my deteriorating equipment. I had gotten through the first 4 parts of this chapter with no problems, and then this last part right before, during the homework, of course, during the homework, I got much more of that audio artifacts of hissing and popping. So I'm recording this last section. I will just mention we're going to be doing the homework here in just a second. If it feels like I'm going through the homework because with a little bit of pace, it's because I've already gone through and explained it once, meaning I had to write it out the first time, but now I've already written it out, so I'm just using the existing notes. I'll show you here in just a minute. One last word on the learning objective number 7, bottlenecks. It comes from a theory called the theory of constraints, which was developed, I guess, basically as the Japanese auto industry was taking over America back in the 70s and 80s. A bunch of industrial engineers here in the U.S. kind of tried to figure out what was going on right and wrong, mostly wrong, with the American manufacturing scene. And one of the ideas was this theory of constraints. And the theory is that every manufacturing process has a bottleneck, whether it's some sort of process or it's a machine or some sort of labor that requires time. This bottleneck is basically where the production narrows down to where there's only a certain amount of production that can fit through the bottleneck during a week or day or whatnot. And so the bottleneck determines the max throughput. In other words, you've heard the phrase, as strong as the weakest link. Well, a production line goes as fast as its slowest process. So what do industrial engineers do about a slow process? Well, first of all, they don't overproduce in front of it. In other words, that sort of will be just creating inventory that'll be stacking up and waiting and not being able to get through the bottleneck. So avoid buildup, avoid overproduction, keep the bottleneck running at full capacity, and also try and eliminate the bottleneck or increase its capacity. If you are contemplating going into a manufacturing environment later on in life or after you get your MBA, one of the books that I'd recommend is called The Goal by Mr. Goldratt. And the book is sort of a novelized version of his experiences during the automotive, situation during the 70s. And he was one of the people that kind of came up with the idea of theory of constraints and how to overcome that. It's actually just if you're into manufacturing or if you're into, sort of cost accounting, it's an interesting book. It's a good quick read. It's not like a textbook or anything. It really is kind of reads like a novel. Any case, let's move on to the homework. So what we have is I'm going to go through a number of questions. I'm going to give you most of the answers, but of course my numbers should be different from yours. So I'm not giving you necessarily the answers. I'm giving you the process on how to get the answers done. So the first one we have here is a make or buy question. And when we read it, company is making 12,000 circuit boards, cost of $34. They can outsource it for $34 for 12,000. So if we look at our numbers here, the make and the buy, we can make it for $34 for the 12,000 units, or we can buy it. So in any case, that's sort of one of those relevant versus irrelevant. Because it's the same between the two alternatives, it's sort of an irrelevant cost, and therefore we can ignore it. So what are relevant? Well, if we buy the product from the vendor, we can clear out part of our factory floor and rent that to a different person. So that I put that as a negative because these are costs and this is a cost saving, right? We're saving 46,000. We're getting income of 46,000. So that's different between the alternatives. And the other difference is, in addition, $6 per unit of the fixed overhead applied to the circuit boards would be totally eliminated. Well, there's $10. Here, let me see. There is $10 in fixed costs, and it says we're able to save $6 of it. Well, that means $4 we can't avoid. So here I have written down what is another cost that differs between the alternatives. We're going to still have to pay the $4 here on 12,000 units. So we're going to save 46,000, but we're going to have to pay 48,000. So the difference here is 2,000 in extra cost. Now, how do we phrase that as far as the answer to the question? 2,000 in extra cost is a disadvantage because once again we phrase it as should we choose the alternative? Should we buy it? And the answer is no, that would be disadvantageous because it would be an extra 2,000 in cost. So we would write it as a negative and call it a net disadvantage. And here they actually put it in parentheses, but I think they actually ask you to use a negative sign. Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. Number 3, this is a limited resources. And so the first, I think, 4 questions are going to be following exactly the special orders, outsourcing, seller process further, and limited resource. Not in that order, but it's going to be covering the 4 scenarios. So this one's a limited resource. And remember, when we talked about limited resource, we're going to be trying to define it in terms of contribution margin per unit of limited resource. So the limited resource here is 720 hours. And we have 3 different types of guitars being made, and they have labor hours per unit, but we only have 720. So they're going to ask you to kind of fill this out. What is the highest unit selling price? Well, the highest unit selling price is the Telecaster. What is the highest contribution per unit? So the contribution margin, the highest one is Strat. And then, they say Stat. They mispronounce. I didn't even notice that the first round. They say Stratocaster. And the highest contribution per labor hour. Well, we think we know which one it is, but I went ahead and worked it out. So if we've got 252, I've just taken these numbers here. 252, 210, and 126 divided by the labor hours. Remember, this is going to be our contribution margin per hour. So we have 7, 8.75, and 3.5. So what is the 8.75? That is the Dreadnought. So we've got 2 electric guitars and we've got a steel string guitar. Now all you have to do is fill in all these tables. For the Telecaster, it's 36 hours. I'm sorry, total labor hours. So 720 for each of these. And then labor hours per unit is 36. Weekly production, if I did 720 divided by 36, that would mean a total of 20 guitars. The unit contribution margin for the Telecaster is 126, and then I could multiply that out. That'd be, 2,520, probably something like that. But the point here is to make sure you can fill in the different charts, and what you'll end up with is a series of weekly contribution. And you'll find out the item, the Dreadnought, that had the highest contribution margin per hour is going to have the highest weekly contribution. And the last part of the question is determine the opportunity cost the company will incur if management requires production of 20 Telecasters. Well, notice that of the 720 hours, if we used all 720 hours on Telecaster, we would produce 20 units. So it says if management requires 20 Telecasters, essentially we can't produce anything else because all 20 Telecasters will take up the 720 hours. So what you're going to do is the weekly contribution for the Telecaster is going to be low, and you're going to look at the Stratocaster and the Dreadnought to see if I have to if I have to build the Telecaster, I'm foregoing one of these two. Well, it's going to be the Dreadnought because that's the highest contribution margin per hour. So whatever the amount of weekly contribution, we're not going to get that, because if management's requiring us to do the Telecaster solely, then we're foregoing whatever the Dreadnought weekly contribution is. And that's what will be in this section here. Okay, next question is going to be question 4. It is sell or process further. Port Allen processes raw material D into joint products E and F. Raw material D costs 4 per liter. It costs 100 to convert 100 liters of D into 60 liters of E and 40 liters of F. Product F can be sold immediately for $4 per liter or processed further in a product G at an additional cost of $3 per liter. Product G can then be sold for $9 per liter. Okay, so I'm just going to guess that your head's kind of swimming from all this stuff, and where do you start? So remember, on sell or process further, that we had the concept that sometimes similar products start with the initial stage and then they split off, right? So here we have, they even tell us that they're joint products, meaning they share an initial production stage. And what we learned in sell or process further, that any of the costs that are joint costs, that are the initial stage before they split off and become their own unique products, are deemed irrelevant because they share that. It's the same between all of them. So everything up from Port Allen up to here, I don't care about, because it has nothing to do with the question. The question is determine if product F should be processed further into G. So all we're looking at is this information here. Product F can be sold immediately for $4. That's what I have. Product F is $4. Product G can be produced for an additional $3. So this is the selling price, and this is the cost. So there's no additional cost to sell F as is at $4. Or we can spend an extra $3 to sell it at $9. So what's the difference? Our differential analysis. The difference in price is $5. The difference in cost is minus $3. So if we spend an extra $3, we can sell it for $9, meaning the difference between the two is $2. So calculate the net advantage after further processing. It'd be $2 per liter. And there it is. Next question is question 5. Here we've got a long one. This one's actually a little tricky. It took me a little bit of time to figure it out. Actually, you can see I kind of got started there, and then I needed to revise my figures. Oh, let's see. I may not have all of these. This one's 5. This is 5. So number 5, it says the company sells a large bag to restaurants for $30. Variable costs are $20, including 1. So first thing I said is, well, we need to split those out. The variable costs here are $19 plus $1 for delivery. And then the total cost is $24, so that means the fixed cost would be $4. Growing conditions have been good and they have extra capacity. Someone comes in and asks for a special order of 6,000 bags, and they're willing to pay $22 instead of the $30. Now, delivery to the restaurants in the other city will cost the company 75 cents per bag. So I'm throwing out here that there is a little difference in the variable cost. It's $19 plus $1 for delivery, or $19 plus 75 cents for delivery. And of course, fixed costs are irrelevant because those are covered by our initial production, right? The fixed costs are covered by the local deliveries. Delivery to the restaurants in the city will cost 75% a bag. It can meet most of the order with excess capacity, but it would sacrifice 400 bags of regular sales to fill this special order. So we actually need to look at two different things. We need to look at the part that is filled by excess capacity and the part that is over capacity. So let's take a look at the excess capacity. Well, we've determined that fixed costs are irrelevant. The only costs that are different, I mean, I could have even gone to the point of just getting rid of the 19. But the difference is $19 plus 75 cents for the delivery. The amount that they're paying us is $22. So we're getting a contribution margin of $2.25. Now, on how many bags? They're buying 600, but 400 of those are going to be over capacity. So we're only getting this special deal on this $225 contribution margin on 5,600 bags. So this is a $12,600 gain. Now, when I look at the overcapacity, what they're paying us $22, and we're normally getting $30, right? For any bags that we take away from existing customers, they were going to pay us $30, and we're now only getting $22. So this loss is going to be $8 of loss times 400 bags, or a $3,200 loss. Now, this is where I stopped at first, and I said, it's not quite coming out right. There's something left. So this is the amount of gain from the extra capacity. This is the amount of loss from the overcapacity. But we have one other thing. Because we're taking 400 bags from our normal customers and selling it to the city, there is going to be some small incremental gain, because our normal variable costs for selling it in the city are $19 plus $1 for delivery. For doing the overcapacity is going to be $19 plus 75 cents for the out of the city delivery. So in other words, we're even though we're getting $8 less by selling at 22, we're also getting a little bit extra, a little bit less costs involved. So we're saving 25 cents on those 400 bags because the delivery is 75 cents versus $1. So there's a $100 gain. So $12,600 is the gain for the extra capacity minus $3,200 loss from the overcapacity. Plus that overcapacity, we should also account for $100 because of the difference in delivery costs. So that should come out to $9,500. Should management consider non-quantitative issues before making a final decision? The answer is yes. Whenever you're going into overcapacity and taking sales from your normal customers, you should always think about that beforehand. Now, as far as letter C, how would the analysis change if the special order was for 6,000? I'm going to allow you to try and tackle that on your own, see if you can, having already kind of laid out all of the necessary kind of groundwork to be able to figure this out. Hopefully you'll be able to figure out C as well. So fill in the correct responses. So I'll give you a hint here. It's 10,500 minus for this set of numbers. So hopefully you can use that to figure out yours. But 9,500 and yes, were the ones we worked through. The next one was number 11. And let's see. I somehow got my numbering off a little here. Is this the one that I'm looking at? I remember this one. I didn't actually need to write anything down. So preview this question. We're considering a new drilling machine for production plant, replace an old drilling machine that costs $12,000 and has $8,400 of accumulated depreciation. The new machine can be purchased at a cash cost of $19,200, but the distributor has offered to take the old machine as a trade-in, thereby reducing the cost to $16,800. Based on this information, calculate the total relevant cost for acquiring a new machine. So this is one of those things that I warned about when we're talking in the chapter, that sunk costs could make you have sort of a decision distortion. Now, what we originally paid for and how much accumulated depreciation has happened in the past. So that book value is not relevant to the discussion. The only discussion is we could do nothing and keep the two alternatives are do nothing and stay with our old drilling machine, or we can buy a new drilling machine. Well, what does the new drilling machine cost us? The new drilling machine is going to cost us $6,800 plus this trade-in. So, I mean, including the trade-in, it's going to be $19,200 plus the trade-in, but the cash that is going to be changing hands is only $16,800. So the only relevant cost between do nothing or get a new machine is just the cost of $16,800. So it's going to should be C here, $16,800 or the net cash paid to the distributor. Now notice here it has 16.8 plus the book value. Remember, we just got through saying the book value is a sunk cost and doesn't come into the do nothing versus buy the new machine relevant analysis. Okay, now we move to 12. This is going to be a question of we're going to one of the parts before we got to the special questions was how do we revisit a profit plan? So this is sort of on that level. Terra produces color cartridges. They sell for 12 each. Here we've got the variable costs, the fixed costs, and the variable distributions assume a sales volume of 24,000. So that's the as is. The question is, if we move to this new scenario where the sales price goes up from 12 to 14, an increase of 2, and the unit sales decrease by 2,400 from 24,000 to 21,600, what would the monthly profit be? So this is a good question. Now, of course, you could longhand it out, but I think they want us to look at, as far as possible, to look at just the relevant costs. So what I've charted out here is, if the current situation is selling price of $12 minus variable costs of $5, that equals $7 of contribution margin. 7 times the volume of 24,000 equals 168. So you notice I had scribbled out something here and I put minus 30. Sort of ignore the minus 30 for right now. Let's look at the second scenario. It would be a sales price of $14, right? An increase of 2. It would still be variable cost of $5, but the contribution margin would be now 9, but on a smaller volume, 21,600. 9 times 21,600 is 194,400. Now, what I was originally starting to write there was to write in minus 30,000, or to show you the number after I had taken out the fixed cost. Now, if you took out the fixed cost, both would go down and it wouldn't change the result. But I just want to point out that probably the idea here is to ignore irrelevant cost, and because 30,000 is the same cost between the two, then we could ignore it. Or if we had gone through and added it, subtracted it out, it would have come to the same difference. So whether you subtracted out 30,000 or left it as is, it would have come to a difference of 26,400, an increase. So by charging a little more, and even though we have a little drop in sales, the increase in the dollar per unit outweighs the decrease in the number of units sold. Let's take a look at number 16. Preview the question. This is a special order. So it's running at 52% capacity, has received a special order to produce 440 cases of soup. It will sell under a private brand label. Everything will be the same except for this private brand label will cost an extra $550 to design. The supermarket has offered to pay only $19 per case, which is well under the normal sales price. And close cost of the current production level, $495, are as follows. 440, even though it's 52%, 440 doesn't go over 100%, the extra 440. So what do we want to look at? Well, we want to look at relevant costs. So our existing production of 495 is going to cover all of the fixed MOH. So all of this fixed MOH gets covered by the existing production. So really the relevant costs are just the variable costs. Direct materials is variable, direct labor is variable, and the variable MOH. So these three, 10, 3, and 2. So 10, 3, and 2, which I've got written down here, 10, 3, and 2 come up to 15. They want to sell it to us for 19, so this is an additional $4 times 440 cases. So that would come out to $1,760. But we have to subtract out the extra cost here of $550. So we would still be free and clear of, even though the cost is a lot lower, it is taking in just the relevant cost, we'd still be free and clear by $1,210 increase. Number 17. Let's see. This one is a make or buy. Let me get this position here so all the numbers on the page, on the screen. We make snorkels. We make snorkels at a cost of $20. Someone has offered to sell it to us at $18 per mask, and we need 90,000. Snorkel, we can avoid only 112,500 of fixed costs. We have 585. So the first thing I did here was say, okay, if I have 585,000 fixed costs when I make it versus when I outsource it, I can avoid 112,500. Well, how much is unavoidable? We still have 472,500 unavoidable costs if we outsource. So let's see. Even though our costs are 20 and they're going to sell it for 18, it's going to be, well, let's check to see what the numbers are. So we're still going to have to pay this if we outsource, and we're going to have to pay the per unit cost. So 18 times 90,000 is 1.62 thousand plus the unavoidable costs comes out to 2.992,500. We can make it ourselves for 1.8, and therefore we would not do that because that would be an increase in costs, or as they term it here, a decline in operating income. So not outsource, and would decline by 292,500. The last one here is number 19. Now, there are a couple of simple questions beyond 19, but essentially I have covered both kind of a complex and a simplified version of each of the major types of questions, and these are just a couple of extra ones that are sort of just practice with maybe a little bit different format, but I should have covered how to do each of these questions a couple times. So the additional ones are going to be practice for you. Okay. So 19, this is not in the book, and it is a concept. It's funny when I say that. This is a normal managerial accounting concept, the indifference point. But even though they have a question on it, they didn't actually write it up in the textbook. I searched through the textbook, and they don't have the actual text and information about the indifference point. But I wanted to go ahead and give this question, and I'm basically going to solve it here for you, is to point out that, again, just like when we were talking about operating leverage, and I said it's really sort of a mask for the bigger issue, which we know is that economies of scale are important. In other words, shifting costs from variable costs into fixed costs and then increasing production is the normal way that major companies do it, and the numbers show it correctly. And so this point here is basically, what is the point? What is the tipping point for where you say, oh, I go from variable cost focus to fixed cost focus? Because as you increase production, you're going to be worried, less about the variable costs and more about the fixed costs. So the indifference point is, what is the point to where whether you make it or you outsource it, it costs exactly the same. It costs exactly the same. And so that point means that below that point, it's better for you to make it. Above that point, it's better to outsource it. So it's a kind of an important concept, even though they forgot. They probably took out the information and then forgot to take out this question. So how do we do this? Let's go through it. Let's read through it. It's actually a simple algebra question. So if I've given you that extra information about the indifference point is where the make costs and the buy costs are the same, we can actually set up an algebra equation to do this. So on the make side shows us with variable costs of $10, 8, and 1, so 19, times some level of production, right? This is our unknown, plus $114,000. Right? Remember, total costs are variable costs plus fixed costs. On the other side, so that should equal at some level the cost of buying it, 24 times that same level of production, but not as much fixed costs, right? Assuming you can eliminate 90,000 of fixed costs. So $24 times some level of production plus $34,000 in fixed costs. Those numbers should equal on both sides. So what we do is solve for the level. So I can subtract 19 from 24. And I can subtract 34 from 114, so 5x equals 90, and x equals 18. So at 18,000 units, making or buying is exactly the same cost. Below that, it will be make it yourself. Above that, it will be buy. And just to double check, it is. Okay, that's the end of going through the homework. Good luck and thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know.